Did Vladimir Putin help Donald Trump win the US presidential election? And how free and fair is Russia's own presidential election next month going to be? I'll ask one of Putin's leading opponents and speak to a former top CIA spy. I'm Mehdi Hassan. Russian leader Vladimir Putin will run for president again next month in what is sure to be a guaranteed victory, given that his only viable opponent has been barred from running. So, will Putin be president for life? Or is there a version of Russian democracy that exists in spite of him? That's our debate. But first, did Putin's Russia collude with Donald Trump during the 2016 US presidential election? Former FBI Chief Robert Mueller, who's investigating that claim, last week indicted 13 Russians and 3 Russian organizations. But did the Trump campaign participate in that election meddling? And should the US really be lecturing Russia on undermining foreign elections, given how many governments the CIA has undermined and even toppled? This week's headliner: Trump critic, former top spy, and 28-year veteran of the CIA and its clandestine service, John Sipher. John Sipher, thanks for joining me on UpFront. The latest indictments from the special counsel's investigation into the 2016 presidential election in the US accuses Russian nationals and organizations of having allegedly meddled in that election. Are you of the view, as many people seem to be in the US these days, that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia and was involved in that meddling?
Well, interesting. So my view is this indictment sets a foundation upon which the legal community and the Justice Department and the Mueller investigation will then look for co-conspirators that were tied with this. You know, the Russians, when they do these things, they call it active measures. So it's intelligence services collect intelligence, but the Russians have always, for their history, been very good at subversion and disinformation and deception, and they also recruit spies to help them do that. That's the issue.
Do you
of collusion.
believe they recruited members of the Trump campaign as part of this alleged campaign?
I have no way of knowing that. But one thing I can say.
But do you believe? I'm asking for your belief.
I can say with certainty that they would try.
His critics hope that Donald Trump, the president of the United States, will be indicted as a conspirator, will be charged with a crime, whatever it is, conspiracy, treason. That's the hope of many of his critics. They point to his behavior. They point to some of the evidence emerging from the special counsel. Do you believe, from what you've seen in the public domain, from what you've heard from behind the scenes as a CIA veteran, do you believe there is a case, at least, for suggesting Donald Trump may have colluded with Russia?
I actually do believe there is a case for that. You know, if we're talking about collusion, you know, we've seen recently with the Stormy Daniels affair, for example.
This is the porn star who he allegedly paid off.
That Mr. Trump's behavior puts him in a position where he could be blackmailed or put himself in trouble. So what we have here is we have the best service in the world at blackmail and using these kind of things to take advantage of people.
Russian intelligence service.
We have someone who's uniquely puts themselves in a position where they could be blackmailed or extorted. Then what we've seen is behavior by people around the Trump campaign, some of whom have been arrested, others that have, the information has come out to show what they've done. Then, taking another step further, when these people are confronted with that, they say they had no connection, lied about it, and then tried to cover it up. And then one step further, Trump and his people attack those very institutions that could hold them accountable. So in my view, this is not the behavior of people who are wholly innocent.
Suspicious behavior in your view.
Absolutely.
But isn't the problem that there is no hard evidence? So far, we're over a year into this administration. There is no actual hard evidence, despite all the media hype, all the coverage, all the testimonies in Congress. There is no hard evidence or smoking gun linking either Trump or his campaign to the Russian government.
These are espionage organizations. Espionage activities are meant to be kept secret. So no, there's no evidence. Evidence is something that legal people find to put into a trial. The bar for evidence is very high. However, the bar for what we've seen in terms of politically bad behavior and unethical behavior and unpatriotic behavior has been met.
Aren't you worried that you might come across as a bit of a conspiracy theorist? Because you say, well, the Russians are great at this, they're great at espionage. On that grounds, you could accuse them of anything and say, well, they're great at covering their tracks. Do you see what I mean? There's no limit to what you could accuse the Russian government of.
I do say what you mean, and I do acknowledge that we don't have evidence to go to a court. Like I said, we've seen behavior that's either unethical and unpatriotic, and there should be a political price to pay for that type of stuff.
You say unethical, unpatriotic behavior. But on the other hand, if he is this Russian stooge, or if he is compromised by Russian intelligence, why then did he, for example, put out a new nuclear strategy calling for more nukes and treating Russia as a major rival? Why has he supported more NATO troops being sent to Poland? Why has he sold more arms to Ukraine than the Obama administration has? How do you explain that?
Personally, I think those things are great, and I think that's exactly the type of activity that we have to take to make it clear to Mr. Putin
why
that he can't do this
if he's compromised by Russian intelligence. Surely that's evidence that he's not.
You know, I don't know. I'm not in the White House. I do think that the deep state that he talks about, and the people, the professionals who work in the FBI and the Defense Department and the CIA and the Director of National Intelligence, these people understand what the Russians have been doing and what the Russians are up to, and have been promulgating policies that I think are good for our country. And I think we're seeing some of that now.
Just one last question on the kind of hacking, alleged hacking, the response by Trump. Intelligence chiefs, including Trump's own CIA Director Mike Pompeo, have warned that the 2018 midterm elections could be targeted by Russian intelligence as well. And a lot of people are criticizing Trump for not proposing countermeasures or some kind of defensive measures. What would you want to see as a response to what you believe is Russian meddling in the election? Are you calling for a kind of counter-cyber war, counter-meddling in the Russian elections, all-out military confrontation? Where does it end?
The actions that Mr. Putin took, those active measures that I talked to you about, these are asymmetric warfare. It's part of their doctrine. And this asymmetric warfare is the doctrine of the weak against the strong. It's like terrorism. You can't take on the United States head on if you don't have the means to do so. This is a means of looking for weaknesses in the American system and taking advantage of those things. Therefore, the way to deal with those is to put pressure on Putin to make clear what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. I think continuing to support arms to Ukraine, making it clear there's a price to pay in his area near abroad where he's taken advantage in Crimea and Ukraine. I do believe that the nuclear posture of increasing our weapon systems and our nuclear weapon systems, I think this all makes sense. I think continuing to develop relations with our NATO partners to push back. I also think there's a whole education issue that has to be done here.
I don't understand about critics of Trump like yourself.
That is, you say he's doing those things.
No, I'm saying, no, much worse than that. I'm saying on the one hand, you say he's unethical, he may be unpatriotic. You're clearly not a fan of him as an individual. But you're also saying, let's give him more nukes and let him escalate possibly a nuclear war with Russia under Putin.
That's not what I said.
Because there just seems to be this disconnect. Lots of people say, we don't like Trump, we don't trust Trump, he might be a Russian stooge, he's clearly off his head. But we think he should escalate a conflict with Russia. That same person. That seems to be a contradiction.
Well, the United States already has the largest and most powerful military in the history of the world. We have the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons.
Even more possibility for military
modernizing those weapons.
But you also talked about making Putin pay a price. All of those things could lead to another major war, could it not? Between two countries.
Could do.
And you're okay with Donald Trump being president when that war comes?
You're doing what Trump and Putin do, is you create a straw man so you can take it down.
I'm going on what you said. You said we should pay a price in Ukraine, and you support the modernization and increase in nuclear weapons. I'm saying, how does that square with you saying you don't trust Donald Trump?
I don't trust Donald Trump.
But you trust him with more weapons and picking a fight with Putin.
I do trust the institutions in this country that are advising Mr. Trump and working against them.
Well, let's talk about one of those institutions, the CIA. John Sipher, you served for 28 years in the Central Intelligence Agency. You were a former senior member. You were part of the U.S. Clandestine Service. Do you see the irony in sitting here criticizing Russia for trying to interfere in foreign elections, given how many foreign elections the CIA has intervened in, given how many foreign governments the CIA has toppled? Iran, 1953, Guatemala, 1954, Brazil, 1964, Bolivia, 1971, Chile, 1973, Haiti, 1991. The list goes on and on and on.
Listen, I'm not going to apologize for being an American. I didn't
ask you to.
I support this country and most of this country's policies. And in those cases, some of them, I will admit, were mistakes. The President of the United States pushed the CIA to get involved in, and the CIA follows the orders of the President of the United States. However, there's a system here by which those people are working on behalf of the Constitution, there's congressional oversight, there's advice and consent to the President and to the White House and people involved with these things. In Russia, those services are working on behalf of a single man. That single man makes those decisions for them.
I'm saying, as someone from the CIA, to talk about foreign interference when you guys meddled, you guys, plural, not just you, meddled in other countries' elections? Does it not seem a bit rich? Jim Woolsey, former head of the CIA, was on Fox News this past weekend laughing about it when he was asking, yeah, we've intervened. We did it for a good cause. I'm sure the Russians would say the same. We're doing it for good reasons as well.
I totally understand that it appears that way. And what I would ask you to look at is look at Mr. Putin and look at what he's trying to push. He's pushing supporting Taliban in Afghanistan. He's supporting Assad in Syria to include their use of chemical weapons. He's overtaken neighboring countries and took up Crimea from Ukraine. So I do think there are issues and there are things that are right and wrong in the world. And I think Mr. Putin's on the wrong side. If we want to talk about mistakes in American foreign policy, we don't have time today to go through all of those. There's plenty of them. I studied.
Many would say they weren't just mistakes, they were crimes for which people have not been held accountable.
Yep. I'm sure there were some, absolutely.
John Sipher, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On March 18th, Russians will go to the polls to decide who will become their next president. But just how fair and democratic will that vote be? The path to the Kremlin for Russian opposition candidates is notoriously dangerous. In 2015, opposition leader Boris Nemtsov was killed, and this year the main challenger to President Vladimir Putin's rule, Alexei Navalny, has been barred from even running. So is Russia today more of a dictatorship than a democracy? And what does the sitting president and former KGB spy Vladimir Putin want for himself and for his country? With me to discuss all of this are Yevgenia Albat, editor-in-chief of The New Times in Moscow, Vladimir Posner, a prominent Russian-American journalist and former Soviet Union spokesman, and Vladimir Kara-Murza, a leading Russian opposition figure and activist. Thank you all for joining me on UpFront. Given there are presidential elections round the corner, I want to begin by asking whether Russia these days can really be classed as a democracy. A lot of people say no. Vladimir Posner.
Partially, you could say that there are some democratic elements today in Russia, but I would hesitate to call it a democracy. It's got a long way to go before it becomes a democracy, if it becomes a democracy. So yes, more than during Soviet times, but still not really a democracy the way I understand one.
Yevgenia, is that a view you share? Is that an accurate description?
No, by any means. As much as I respect Vladimir Posner, I would say that it's impossible to call Russia a democracy. It's not a democracy. It's not a dictatorship either. It is a country which is run by a corporation, the graduates of the former political police, the KGB. And what we're going to have on March 18th, 2018 has nothing to do with elections. There will be no elections. There are no elections. There is no choice in Russia. It's just reappointment of Vladimir Putin for the fourth term in the office.
And Vladimir Kara-Murza, you wrote an article recently saying Western leaders shouldn't recognize Russia's election, shouldn't give it their, quote, international seal of approval. Why not?
Well, when we speak about elections in Russia, we have to put the word in quotation marks, because for more than 18 years now, we've not had a free and fair and democratic election in our country. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at all the reports by OSCE observers and Council of Europe observers who have monitored Russian elections in these past 2 decades. And it's frankly very puzzling when every time we've had elections, again, so-called elections in our country, we have observers coming in from the OSCE, from the Council of Europe, from democratic nations. And these observers are issuing these absolutely damning reports that there's no real competition, there's no real choice, these are not real elections. And yet, a few hours after these observers from Western countries issue those reports, the leaders of those same Western countries, the democratically elected presidents and prime ministers, pick up the phone and call Mr. Putin to congratulate him. To congratulate him on what? In effect, on a successful theft of the votes. And when we're speaking about this so-called presidential election that will take place on the 18th of March, we can discuss for a long time all the different ways and methods the Kremlin has mastered in terms of manipulating and controlling the electoral process. But I think, frankly, it is enough to mention just one fact. There were 2 prominent opposition leaders who were planning to challenge Vladimir Putin for the presidency in 2018. One was Boris Nemtsov, the former Russian deputy prime minister, the most recognizable face of the Russian democratic opposition, who will not be on the ballot next month because he was killed almost 3 years ago on the bridge in front of the Kremlin. And the second challenger is the anti-corruption activist Alexei Navalny, who spent the last year campaigning all across the country, drawing hundreds and thousands of people at rallies everywhere he went. And he's not going to be on the ballot because the Russian authorities have deliberately disenfranchised him with a politically motivated court conviction that was, by the way, overturned already by the European Court of Human Rights, but it still served as grounds to disenfranchise him. It is not difficult to win an election when your opponents are not actually on the ballot.
And so let's put that point to Vladimir Posner. If it's not that difficult to win an election when your opponent's not on the ballot, but what's the point of the election? Is it just for international approval? Is it just to kind of give some kind of fig leaf of legitimacy? If there's no choice, if there's this manipulation, as Yevgenia and Vladimir Karamurza are pointing out, what's the point of these elections?
Before I answer that question, I'd like to make a point myself. When I was asked to participate in this program, I said I was not interested in getting into a debate. I am not a debater, I'm a journalist. I'm not an opposition, I'm not a pro. I'm not a big fan of Putin's, but I like to try to be objective. With all due respect, Mr. Karamurza, as you said, is an active opposition person, and so is Yevgenia Albatsin, what she does in her magazine. I'm simply not interested in that kind of discussion. It's very clear what they're going to say, probably pretty clear what I'm going to say, because people do go to the poll and they do vote, and for whatever reasons, Putin has a very high percentage of support. And it's not because people are stupid. As I say again, I'm not a Putin supporter, but either you have to see things the way they are, or you describe them the way you want them to be or want people to believe them to be. It's not a discussion I'm interested in. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the two people talk and agree with each other on all the negative things that they're going to say, and I'll do some other stuff that is much more interesting for me. So I'm going to thank you for the opportunity, but that's about it. I really have no interest in participating in this. This is an ideological debate, and I'm no longer interested in ideology. Thank you very much.
What did you want to
I'm
debate, just out of interest? Wow.
Well, I think, unfortunately, with all the respect for Mr. Posner's professionalism,
First time that's happened on UpFront, I've got to say that.
many years in Russian media and all its various guises in Soviet in the 90s and today, I think that is actually the basic point about the people who are either open Putin supporters or who pretend to be objective but who are in fact Putin supporters, that they always run away from genuine debate.
So just to clarify for our viewers, we had a guest, Vladimir Posner, joining us from London, who's a well-known Russian journalist, here to try and express a different view to Vladimir Karamurza, who is an opposition activist, and Yevgenia Alberts, who is an independent journalist in Moscow. He's decided to leave us. Let me go to Yevgenia Alberts in Moscow, and let me ask you this. When you hear people like Vladimir Posner, who's now departed this show, say you're ideologues, you're opposition figures, what's your response to that?
I'm surprised because Vladimir Posner is a very experienced, very professional journalist, and he himself spent quite some time working as a Soviet propaganda mouthpiece during the Soviet times, and then he himself denied that. Vladimir Posner has his own show on Channel 1, which belongs to the state and which is unfortunately is just another propaganda machine to mislead Russian people.
Yevgenia, a lot of people watching...
Therefore, I understand his move.
A lot of people watching might wonder how it is that in a country where we hear there's so much propaganda and crackdowns on the press, how does someone like you operate then? You seem to be running a magazine, you're here, you're speaking from Moscow, speaking freely to me now and to our audience about what's going on. How does that all fit together?
It is very difficult. Unlike it was under the Soviet Union, Russia is not a totalitarian state. So they allow for some opposition voices to exist. I had, however, to close the paper version of my magazine because people were afraid and still afraid to give us ads. Because to give ads to the New Times magazine was to publicly express your support to the opposition. That's a quote of one of the prominent Russian oligarchs whom I couldn't name. So therefore, we are running on very small budgets. The magazine now is only digital, and most likely we will go out of business in the months to come.
Let me put that point to Vladimir Kara-Murza, who's here with me. You've been targeted, you say, by the Russian government. You've, I think, not once but twice, attacks on your life in the form of poisonings, you say. That you had to leave the country when you were poisoned. So how does an opposition figure survive in Putin's Russia if, as you say, people like yourself are targeted?
Well, first of all, that's not what I say. That's the official doctor's diagnosis from my Moscow hospital both times, that it was acute intoxication of an unknown origin. The first attempt was in 2015. The second was just last year. But, you know, this is nothing new, frankly. We have known for a very long time that it is a dangerous and risky vocation to be in opposition to Mr. Putin's regime. And so many of our friends and colleagues have been forced to leave, have been put into prison, have been harassed and attacked. And as we were just discussing a minute ago, the most prominent leader in the Russian opposition, Boris Nemtsov, has been assassinated 200 yards from the Kremlin wall in the middle of Moscow 3 years ago. And in terms of the level of political repression...
Look, as much as I'm sympathetic to what you say, let's be fair. A lot of us here in Moscow, as much as we recognize the dangers and, you know, the attacks on your life, and of course, you know, what happened to Boris Nemtsov is a great tragedy. However, please, don't exaggerate. Each week, on Monday and on Tuesday, I go out and echo Moscow with the audience all across Russia, and I say precisely what I consider right to say. So I think it's also very important not to mislead the public outside the Russian Federation.
Vladimir, are you misleading? Are you exaggerating about the situation?
Well, no, first of all, I think there's no question that Russia today is not the Soviet Union. It is not a totalitarian state. We do not have closed borders. I think it is also absolutely true that the current regime is much more creative and much more intelligent about how it affects its political control. But I think it's also absolutely fair and absolutely factual to say that the level of political repression is fast approaching the late Soviet period.
Okay, Yevgeny, Russia has gone through revolutions, collapse, regime change, wars in the past 100 years or more. Is there a fear of instability that is shared by a lot of Russian people and by many politicians? And is that what allows a man like Putin to stay in power for so long? Does it make someone as authoritarian as Putin inevitable in a country like yours?
I cannot subscribe to that. I don't believe in all these cycles of authoritarianism in Russia. Whereas some people, you know, are crying wolves outside Russia, Alexei Navalny has managed to ask people out on the streets, and people went out on the streets in 118 cities of the Russian Federation. Of course, you know, this type of regime is no friend to democracy by any means. It goes without saying that Putin will tighten screws after his yet another inauguration in May 2018. However, I think that part of the blame should be put on Russian liberals and Democrats who were complicit with the regime for that reason or another.
Okay, let's, one last question to you, Vladimir Kara-Murza. The Speaker of Parliament in Russia has said, if there is Putin, there is Russia. If there is no Putin, there is not Russia. There is this kind of personalization now around the leader. What happens after Putin's gone? He wins the next election, he serves another 6 years till 2024, then he can't serve anymore under the current rules. Is he going to go? Is there going to be a post-Putin Russia, or is he going to stay on for life somehow?
First of all, that statement that you quoted from Mr. Volodin, that is one of the most insulting statements I have ever heard about Russia or the Russian people. To even suggest that, you know, there wouldn't be a country with such a rich heritage, such a great culture as Russia, without any one person, let alone this one, is absolutely insulting. Please don't confuse a country with an authoritarian regime that misrules it. Those are not one and the same thing.
I think that's
and Russia has existed long before Putin.
Trend that applies to a lot of countries, not just
for a long
Russia.
time after him.
And when you say after him, when will we see the back of him, do you think, in your view?
One thing, again, I'm a historian by education, one thing we definitely know from the modern history of Russia is that big political changes in our country happen quickly and unexpectedly.
Let me put that last word to you, Yevgenia. Do you agree with that there's no guarantee if Putin's re-elected that he lasts a full term to 2024? Or do you think he stays on for life? He changes the rules again?
Putin cannot allow himself to step down. He will remain to be a front man for the corporation. Corporation will never allow him to go unless this corporation and Putin himself will be challenged by people from outside Kremlin. And that's exactly my hope, that the minute they realize that country is going down the hill, its economy is in pieces, the Russian elite will start looking for another leader. And at that moment, Putin is doomed.
We'll have to leave it there. Yevgenia Albats, Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you both for joining me on this show. Vladimir Posner decided to leave at the beginning, but I think we still had a very interesting discussion. Appreciate your insights. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.